Matthew 17, 14 through 20. Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. So I'm curious, how many of you have heard the story at some point about testing the windows of airplanes using a chicken or turkey cannon? How many of you have heard of this? Yeah. I heard this. My dad told me this when I was in school, and I've never forgotten it. And so I did a little research on this story, and I have found the not the origin of it, because what I have found was printed after I heard it for sure. But Meat and Poultry Magazine gives one accounting of the story. Now, I think I heard it as a turkey, but this is saying it's a chicken, which does make more sense. Here's the story. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration has a unique device for testing the strength of windshields on airplanes. The device is a gun that launches a dead chicken at a plane's windshield at approximately the speed that the plane flies. The theory is that if the windshield doesn't crack from the carcass impact, it'll survive a real collision with a bird during flight. It seems the British were very interested in this and wanted to test a windshield on a brand new speedy locomotive they were developing. They borrowed the FAA's chicken launcher, loaded the chicken, and fired. The ballistic chicken shattered the windshield, broke the engineer's chair, and embedded itself in the back wall of the engine's cab. The British were stunned and asked the FAA to recheck the test to see if everything was done correctly. The FAA reviewed the test thoroughly and had one recommendation: use a thawed chicken. Come on. I laughed when I was in school, when I was a kid, and my dad laughed, and I've heard that a few times since. You will be interested to know that the rendition I just read for you is from Snopes.com, which I'm not saying can be trusted all the time, but that's a website that tries to say whether or not these stories are actually true. Let's see a show of hands. Who thinks, according to Snopes, that story is actually true? Who thinks it's false? They say it's false, so can never really know. It sounds a little too good to be true. But the humor of the story is in the profound ineptitude that's demonstrated in it. To fire they mention a locomotive here, unless that's another word for a plane. What I heard was they were testing a plane, a British plane. And that, the ineptitude comes in the fact that you'd fire a completely frozen chicken, which would greatly increase impact, of course. And I don't know, Molly, you could ask your dad. I'm not real sure. I don't know that planes encounter a lot of frozen birds. I think by and large they're thawed at a certain altitude. So, ineptitude can be really funny. And if you think about it, there's tons of funny jokes that have to do with ineptitude. And also in our own lives, if we're honest about it, our own ineptitude can be pretty funny. I have done some staggeringly stupid stuff in my life, and I look back on it and I think, my goodness. We prefer to laugh at the ineptitude of others. We like when others mess up. And that's actually one of the things that makes comedies funny. Comedies on television or in the movies largely fly on wings of ineptitude, when someone's just kind of a clown, keeps messing up. Ineptitude can be funny. It can also be tragic. And it can also be very, very frustrating. In Matthew 17, our passage, Jesus and Peter, James, and John encounter the ineptitude of the other disciples who were not on the Mount of Transfiguration. And it's not funny. It's tragic, and Jesus is actually clearly agitated and irritated by the ineptitude of his own followers. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at this and ask ourselves, what is our frozen chicken moment? How do we really drop the ball when we should be further along with Jesus? So the first point I want to make about our story is this, and then we'll read it as we go. The church can be a mixed bag, with some on the mountaintop of revelation and others on the lowlands of failure. The church can be a mixed bag, with some on the mountaintop of revelation and others in the lowlands of failure. What do I mean? Well, first of all, I'm saying church here. I'm referring to disciples of Jesus. I think that's a good definition of church. And if we take that picture, that disciples are indicative of the church is comprised of disciples, then you can look at a story like this and make a deduction about church. One of the shocking contrasts here is between Peter, James, and John, who were just on the Mount of Transfiguration and saw this amazing moment of revelation, of unveiling, of power, of light, of transfiguration. Then they come down from the mountain and encounter what we're going to encounter here. So take a look at our first verse, verse 14. And when they came to the crowd, now this is important. The they is Jesus, Peter, James, and John, who were just on the Mount of Transfiguration. So you got it. They're coming down from the mountain, and this is what they find. When they came to the crowd, a man came up to him, Jesus, and kneeling before him said, Lord, that may or may not mean saving faith, but it certainly at the very least means respect, and it may mean saving faith. Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly, for often he falls into the fire and often into the water. Craig Blomberg, the New Testament scholar, points out that Matthew alone uses the word epilepsy, or the word where we get the word epilepsy from. He's using the word seizures. Some translations use something like lunacy, which does not translate well in our day. These are seizures. Now, in just a moment, we're going to see that the seizures are caused by a demon. But I do want to make clear that the point isn't that epilepsy is necessarily demon possession, right? The point is that this epilepsy is demon possession. I actually get fairly irritated on this idea that ancient people were so dumb that they did not know the difference between physical and even some mental problems and just went around calling everything demon possession. I don't deny it happened. There's some tragic cases throughout history. It's undeniable when the church, especially with mental health problems, when Christians of an earlier time would say, well, he must be demon possessed or she must be demon possessed. Actually, not too far back in our own country's history, you could find stuff like that. However, I do deny that it's that simple. The idea that people 2,000 years ago had literally no concept of illness, that everything was demon possession. Now, I'm sure there were people who suffered from seizures that they did not think were demon possessed. This child is, as we're going to see in just a moment. But that's really not the point. The main point is verse 16. And I brought him, the father says, to your disciples, and they could not heal him. This is why I say that the church can be a mixed bag, with some on the mountaintop of revelation and others in the lowlands of failure. Peter, James, and John are literally coming off of a spiritual high. They've been up on the Mount of Transfiguration. They've been privileged to see this unbelievable thing. The voice of the Father from heaven has spoken to them. Listen to him, to Jesus, he says. They've had this great moment. So part of Jesus' disciples are up here. They've seen something amazing. And then the rest of them are down here and they're fumbling. They're having their frozen chicken moment. Brooke, you had to have been here for the frozen chicken reference. I'll have to tell you later on. It does make sense. I think we need to remember this for the church today. In any church, someone is close to the Mount of Transfiguration. Man, they're growing with Jesus. They're seeing things, the truth of Christ. They're growing deeper in their faith, these powerful moments. And in the same body of disciples, you'll have someone else who's like these disciples. They're just fumbling. They're dropping the ball. And I am going to call it a fumble because in a moment, Jesus is going to rebuke them very severely. Michael Card calls it the most severe rebuke the disciples ever received from Jesus. What does this mean? It means that when you are on the mountaintop with Jesus, you don't need to be frustrated and give up with those who are in the valley. Not everyone at any given point is in the exact same place. So I want to remind you of what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:14. We urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with all. Now, again, Jesus is going to rebuke, but then Jesus is going to give a word of hope. Jesus doesn't just come and unload on these guys and then walk off. Man, you guys are terrible. You dropped the ball. See you later. No, he's going to say to them something about their faith, but then he's going to point out to them what their faith could be. But I just don't want us to miss this point. Mount of Transfiguration, things are going great. Foot of the mountain, things are not going well. The reality is we should never be haughty when we're on the Mount of Transfiguration, because it's a pretty short step to being at the foot of the mountain ourselves. We already saw that in Matthew 16 with Jesus, with Peter and Jesus. Peter goes from Jesus saying, well done, God has revealed this to you, to immediately saying, get behind me, Satan. Be careful. Don't be haughty on the mountain and don't despair in the valley. Remember that we're all on this journey together. Second point I want to make is this. Jesus is rightly frustrated when his disciples fail to be what he has equipped them to be. Now, some, not many, some have attempted to argue that verse 17 is Jesus rebuking the unbelieving world. I'm going to argue that this is clearly directed to the disciples because you see it again at the end of this section. Now, it does sound like the kind of thing he says sometimes, especially to the religious leaders and lost people, but this is aimed at his disciples. Jesus is rightly frustrated when his disciples fail to be what he has equipped them to be. Look at verse 17. And Jesus answered. Now the Father has just said your disciples could not heal him. Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. You know, that whole how long am I to bear with you? I got to think personally, that would have been hard to hear from Jesus. Like, I find your presence exhausting. Now, some people have questioned that, but Jesus has done nothing wrong here. Some people have tried to say that on the mountaintop you see his deity and here you see his humanity. I don't think you have to make those distinctions. Jesus is rightly frustrated. What is his frustration? Well, in part, it's this, that 7 chapters previous in Matthew 10, we find this, Matthew 10:5. Then these 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost house of Israel and proclaim as you go, saying the kingdom of God is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. So what has Jesus equipped them to do? Heal the sick and cast out demons. What have they failed to do? Heal the sick and cast out demons. Probably a better order, cast out the demon and heal the sick. This is important. It's important for this reason. Jesus does not grow irritated because they are not doing something that he hasn't equipped them to do. He's irritated because he has equipped them to do this. Not only has he equipped them to do it, they've done it before. So in some sense, Matthew 17 represents a regress from Matthew 10. Now, we all know what that's like. We have moments when we take one step forward, but then we have moments when we take 2 steps back. I'm not saying we're better. But see here that Jesus, while he doesn't give up on them, he doesn't condemn them to a lost eternity or anything like this, he is rightly agitated at them. He wants them to walk with him. Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a real famous theologian, maybe you've probably heard of him in the 50s and 60s. Reinhold Niebuhr once said The world is full of half-believing unbelievers and of half-unbelieving believers. I'm going to repeat it because that's when you got to hear it twice. You ready? The world is full of half-believing unbelievers. You got that? And of half-unbelieving believers. He's talking about the fact that Jesus rebukes their faith. Look back at verse 17. Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me," the boy. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus. I love that they came privately. Why do you think they went privately? This is kind of humorous to me. What are they? They kind of know what's going to happen. By and large, performance reviews are best done in private, right? Especially when it's like me and Jesus. Jesus, could we step over there so you could say what you need to say to me? So why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, because of your little faith. Meaning you haven't progressed. Man, I commissioned you, I equipped you, I empowered you, and here you have this tortured child, and you just dropped the ball. Your faith is weak, he says to them, and because of this, he's agitated. The world is full of half-believing unbelievers and of half-unbelieving believers. According to what Niebuhr says, the disciples here were acting like half-unbelieving believers. They believed, but their faith had somehow taken a step back. This leads me to my third and final point, and then we'll talk about this. Even so, despondency must not eclipse hope in the hearts of struggling disciples. Even so, even when we drop the ball, despondency must not eclipse hope. We need to receive our comeuppance, right? Our rebuke. We all have to. There's never been a time when Jesus has rebuked you and you've said, well, that wasn't fair. I mean, it hadn't been that time in my life. I'm always like, well, thank you for holding back, because I deserve more. But despondency must not eclipse hope. So watch what he says in the conclusion of our text in verse 19 and 20. The disciples came to him privately and said, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, because of your little faith. But then he says this, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. The idea of moving a mountain was a pretty common metaphor in Jewish life. It was used, for instance, it's used in Isaiah a few different times to refer to accomplishing something that is seemingly impossible. It is a metaphorical thing. I don't say that to lessen it, but it was just a common way of saying that. But if you listen to what Jesus says, it really raises a little bit of a problem. Listen again and tell me if you can get it. Tell me what the conundrum is here. He said to them, because of your little faith, that's why you couldn't do it. So he rebukes them for their little faith. But then he says, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you'll say to this mountain, move, and it'll move. So here's the problem. The problem is little faith, but the solution, according to Jesus, is what? Little faith. Frederick Dale Bruner, who's just a fantastic New Testament scholar, put it like this. At first glance, Jesus' answer isn't helpful. For if our problem is little faith, and if the solution to our problem is little faith, what is the difference between the problem and the solution? What distinguishes bad little faith from good little faith? And then Bruner does what probably some of you have already done. He turns to Mark's account of this story in Mark 9. And Mark gives us one little detail. It's a little different, the tellings, but it's the same story. Mark puts it like this. Mark 9:28. When he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And Jesus said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." So this helps us understand. There is a little faith that is little because faith is shrinking. And then there is a little faith that dares to believe and praise. Frederick Dale Bruner gave maybe the most beautiful definition of prayer I have ever heard. Say again? Oh, I don't know if I can say it again. What I just said? There is a little faith that's little because faith has shrunk. And then there is a little faith that dares to believe that it can be more. Was that the sentence? I hope that's right. Frederick Dale Bruner gave a definition of prayer on the basis of this. It's only 5 words. I think it's stunning. Here's what he said. Prayer is simply faith breathing. Prayer is faith breathing. It's inhaling and exhaling. It's Frederick Dale Bruner, B-R-U-N-E-R. Now, I love that. It's poetic, and I like poetic stuff, so obviously it's not a literal thing, but prayer is faith breathing. It's faith exhaling in prayer, inhaling in hope. Prayer is faith breathing. So what's the difference between good little prayer and bad little prayer? I'm going to argue, and then you can tell me what you think. In context, he rebukes their little faith that could not heal because it clearly represents a corruption from their earlier faith that could heal in Matthew 10, right? They were able to cast out demons. Here they can't. So it's not, in other words, literally the size of the faith. It's the forces at play that got it there. Sometimes our faith is small because we're buffeted and going through difficult times. Sometimes it's small because we've grown very lazy, right? The second one is worthy of rebuke. The first one is worthy of sympathy. Sometimes it's small because we're a new believer and we're just growing. In that sense, the small faith of a new believer may be infinitely bigger than the small faith of a long-time believer who stopped growing. They're both small, but one of them should be rebuked. The other should be celebrated. One of them is worthy of censure. The other can say to a mountain, move, and it'll move. So the problem isn't my faith is small. The problem is, why is it? Mustard seed faith is powerful. These little kids, we had a number of decisions at Vacation Bible School, and we're careful with that. We want to make sure they really believe. But I'll tell you what's never a concern. I'm never concerned about a simple, small faith. Jesus loves a simple, small faith. We all start there. The person who says, I need you, Jesus, they're not a theologian. They are, actually. But, they're not an academic theologian or something, but they have a simple, pure, beautiful faith. So that's not the problem. The problem is, like Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews said a few weeks ago, you should have been eating meat. Your faith is small because you're shrinking, as opposed to a faith that's helping you grow, even though it's small.